Hi, friends. Lovely to be with each of you tonight. Thank you for joining us for what is our fourth of 6 table talks in our Fall Forum series. I am Mallory Wyckoff. I serve as Executive Director of Faith and Culture Center. We're so glad to be with you all this evening. I'm really excited for the topic we're going to get to explore with our incredible team of panelists that I'll introduce in just a few moments. But as I said, my name is Mallory. I've been with Faith and Culture Center for about 1.5 years now, but FCC has been around really since 2008. We got our start back in 2008 when a when a local mosque here was firebombed by a group of white supremacists. And really out of the ashes of that experience, a group of people came together and sought to determine what would be the best response and how can we bring people together? How can we bring people together specifically across divides, the divides of religion, race, ethnicity, and culture, that things that tend to keep us separate, and instead have those be the very things that bring us together around shared tables, shared meals, shared conversations, so we can build community and friendships and relationships together. We have what is called the Our Muslim Neighbor Initiative. And so specifically, we are really seeking to help people get to know their Muslim neighbors, to help them build relationships with Muslims here in Middle Tennessee and beyond, in doing that to combat and counter Islamophobia, and to combat pernicious typecast and stereotypes of Muslims. And I'm certain that our table talk tonight will help lead to that end, and that's part of why I'm so thrilled to get to hear from our panelists tonight. Just a quick note about our table talk series, as I met a few more people here into the room. A quick note about this series is that everything that we do at FCC, as I said, is designed to bring people together. But in the year of 2020, bringing people together is problematic. And so we have been trying to figure out what are ways that we can still execute that mission, but still keep people safe. And so we created this series as a way to bring our table to the community and to even beyond the Middle Tennessee community. We have folks joining us from all over the United States, and we're certainly glad that our table is able to be extended that way, even if we can't gather in person. So the Table Talk series is called Table Talks: Getting to Know Our Muslim Neighbors and Ourselves. And the specific talk tonight is Islam in the West, a history of Muslims in America. And as you will hear the panelists describe that too often Islam is considered to be antithetical to the West or antagonistic towards the West. And so I specifically wanted to put those two words together to even show that in fact, Muslims have been part of the American story from its very inception. And I'm eager to hear from the panelists as they will elaborate on that in rich detail. So we'll get to hear from them in a moment. Just a word of sort of administrative piece before I introduce the panelists. If your video is not already muted, if you're not a panelist, if you'll do me a favor and go ahead and just hide your video for now and be sure that your audio is muted. We'll start with the first hour or so getting to hear from our panelists. And then for the final 30 minutes or so, I'm going to invite those of you who are joining to turn on your video if you'd like, even if you're in your pajamas, that's okay. It's 2020, there's no shaming. To open your video and turn on your audio and then join in the conversation. That will be a space for you to pose questions to our panelists, to add your own comments and insight and reflection, and that will be a time to engage you there. So I'll give you the cue when that's time, and that's kind of how our evening will go together. So allow me to introduce this incredible team of panelists who I'm thrilled to have here and honored that they've joined us for tonight. First, Dr. Sylvia Chan Malik comes to us as Associate Professor in the Departments of American and Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Rutgers, New Brunswick, where she directs the Social Justice Program, chairs the Faculty Advisory Board of the Center for Islamic Life, and teaches courses on race and ethnicity in the U.S., Islam in and America, social justice movements, and food justice. And among other things, and among other important work, she's the author of Being Muslim, A Cultural History of Women of Color in American Islam. Dr. Sylvia Chan Malik, we're thrilled that you're here. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Did you want to go ahead and introduce everyone, or should I just get started?
I'll introduce them, and then I'm going to offer a couple introductory questions first, and then I'll kick it off to you to start the history portion.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Dr. Miller, actually one of my colleagues at Lipscomb University where I teach, he joined the history faculty at Lipscomb University in Nashville back in 2011. He's a widely published social historian with a specialty in the history of Islamic Spain. He earned a doctorate in medieval studies from Yale University. And as I said, he's been at Lipscomb since 2001. And interestingly, he has a blog called Eccentric Culinary, where he explores food and topics as diverse as the history of sushi in America, Chilean cuisine, and the development of chicken and waffles. So those of you who are here in Nashville will appreciate some of those themes particularly. Dr. Miller, we're glad you're here. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you for asking me. I'm glad to be here.
And last and certainly not least, Brennan McDaniel. He is a Tennessee native, grew up in Morristown, Tennessee. He's a PhD student in American Studies at Yale University, and his research is broadly concerned with Islam and the lives of Muslims in Appalachia and the U.S. South. He earned his BA at Vassar College in Gender and Sexuality Studies, Native American Studies, and Africana Studies, and he did his master's at Columbia University in American Studies. Brennan, we are so glad you're here. Thanks for joining us.
It's so my pleasure to be here, really.
Thank you. Well, based on just those bios alone, I'm certain that it's clear to you why I have asked these three to join us and to share with their share of their insight and knowledge and wisdom tonight. And so I'm going to open it up with a few questions here. So firstly, briefly, I just want to ask our panelists, give us a sense of how you kind of come to this conversation. Why does this conversation matter to you? What is it particularly about the themes of the history of Muslims in America and related themes? How do you come to that conversation, and why is it important to you? Dr. Miller, I'll start with you.
Sure. Well, I have a kind of an academic interest in minorities and how they integrate into dominant cultures. So I actually wrote my dissertation on the Mozarabs, who are a group of Arabic-speaking Christians who lived in medieval Spain. And as the Reconquista proceeded, and as Christians came back and reconquered or conquered Spain, how did Arabic-speaking Christians integrate into Spanish society? So for me, as I learned Arabic, I met a lot of Muslims and was friends with a lot of Muslims, including a number of converts. And there's a kind of paradoxical, or I should say, parallel sort of or analogous situation with Muslims in America and how they're integrating into American society. I always tell people I'm always really interested in how small groups of migrants or small groups of immigrants integrate into dominant society. So how do people like, for example, Syrian farmers who find themselves in North Dakota, how do they integrate into that? And that's a situation you find in the 1920s. So that's always kind of fascinating to me. And I spent a lot of time reading about that and studying it and thinking about the problems of integration on a very large scale, meaning 1,000-year period. So for me, it's began as an academic and became a little more personal, I would say.
Thanks. Dr. Chan Malik, how about you?
Well, first of all, thank you, Mallory, and everyone that's here on the call for joining us. It's so lovely to virtually be with you in this space tonight. I started graduate school, to answer the question, in August of 2001, and I entered graduate school, and maybe Brennan, you're closer to this than I am, with a very vague idea of what I wanted to study. I was at UC Berkeley at the time, doing my PhD. And 2 weeks later, after I began graduate school, 9/11 happened. And as someone who was very involved in student activism and advocacy, I immediately became involved with efforts working with the Muslim community in the Bay Area beyond, because there were a rash of hate crimes that were going on at that time against Muslims in the area. And what I found, and what shocked me as someone who had not learned very much about Islam and Muslims at all in my entire upbringing in the very diverse Bay Area in California, was that I had never encountered, even as an Asian American, someone who had studied African American history and literature, Native American and Indigenous history and literature, all of these different types of histories and cultures, I had never encountered anything in which the reality of Muslims and the history of Islam in the United States as lived by Muslims themselves was so different than the representations and portrayals of what was seen as Islam and Muslims in the media and politics. And honestly, as someone who was quite naive in this regard, I was shocked. I was shocked that there was such a distortion of this religion and Muslims themselves within the media. It shocked me that these things could even be said, right, in the aftermath of 9/11. So it became deeply personal to me too, as with Dr. Miller, to say, why is this happening? Why do these types of myths, truths get passed around and circulated as truth? And why do we as Americans collectively buy into these notions of who Muslims are? And it quickly became more of a story about why we believe these things and less a story about, you know, who Muslims actually are. And so I wanted to demystify why we as Americans think these things, and then go on to find out who Muslims are in the United States and what that history is. And at this point, it is very important to me to share that history with others, because I think that is a key to bringing about better conversations and better discourse in this country and beyond.
Absolutely. Thank you. Brennan, how do you come to the conversation? Why does it matter to you?
Yeah, that's a really amazing question, actually. First of all, it's so good to be here with all of you. There's so many people that I absolutely adore that keep joining this room, actually. And it sort of, I think, ties into the question, too. Basically, I had been sort of, mystified by sort of this one particular kind of movement that was sort of going around in East Tennessee, around people sort of reclaiming this word Melungeon. This was a word used to sort of describe people in my family and community for the longest time. And these people in this movement were sort of, writing books, amateur genealogists, historians, kind of really cool public-facing work being done. And a lot of it actually was sort of borrowing from certain, myths of Appalachia, right? There's all, talks of, the lost colony of Roanoke, sort of, mysterious, roaming colonies of Turks or, other folks that are, sort of, assumed to have arrived in Appalachia at some point. And in sort of this Melungeon literature, there was a lot of these references to, Moorishness or Turkness or Arabness, right? Like these sort of proto-racial kind of designations that were kind of floating around in the South. And at the time, I didn't really have anything to do with it. I was sort of, it was all just sort of tangential kind of noise related to my project. But then a while back, my sister, who actually just arrived, she converted to Islam. So this was sort of the first member of my family to start practicing Islam. And like Dr. Chan Malik said, it was just sort of the first time that, I was sort of at an age where these sort of representations of Islam and Muslims online was looking very different from the, the increasing Muslim presence in East Tennessee, from, Muslims in my family, so on and so forth. And during graduate school at Columbia, I sort of started to interrogate lots of these things. I connected with people like Will Isom, who's here, and, Muslim friends, some of which are in my apartment right now. And, I think all of this is to say that I think, Islam is a very sort of communal, sort of family-oriented kind of practice, actually, how I imagine it. And I sort of fell into it through sort of, making kin and sort of establishing bonds with people near and far. So I converted to Islam in my master's program, which is kind of funny because I think, in graduate school, you sort of think that you sort of know everything, but it was a humbling moment where I realized I didn't really know a whole lot about the world, and sort of arriving at this realization was really important for me. I see it as both an obligation that I have, both to my community, to my family, to sort of, just try to capture, rather than try to, offer some new theories about, why Islamophobia exists, or sort of when it started or what started it, to try to just kind of document the ways in which people live sort of in spite of these things, particularly in places like Appalachia and the US South that are imagined to be homogeneously white, homogeneously Protestant, and this sort of landscape that's changing, very much so since 9/11, but since a little bit earlier as well. I think it's just something that I'm, really interested in documenting and capturing and trying to pass on.
Wonderful, thank you. So you mentioned 9/11. So before we get into actual sort of the meat of this this discussion, which is about the history, right, of Muslims in America, I want to ask sort of a contextualizing question first. And this helps us get at, again, why does this conversation matter so much? Why is it essential? For a lot of Americans, their first real awareness of Muslims, of Islam, was immediately after 9/11. They had not even really given much consideration to Muslims or to the faith of Islam until this moment. And all of a sudden now they were beginning to become aware of some things that they hadn't previously. And that's true for certainly not all, but for many Americans. And so I'm wondering if you might be able to speak to how has that shaped things for us? How has that shaped the landscape? And why is that so significant? How is that even informing our conversation tonight? So Brennan, let's start back with you, if you don't mind speaking to that.
Yeah, one of the things so I guess I was sort of, brought to, if I were to sum up everything I just said, I was sort of brought, to Islam and Muslims through sort of kinds of clashes of images or ideas or conversations that I had just sort of not lining up. And I think one of the biggest things that 9/11 did, at least in terms of its lasting impact, is I think sort of, obvious, right? That it sort of, prior to 9/11, the way that Islam was discussed in, colloquially in the United States, to my understanding, is very often, it would get lumped together in with this category of Eastern religions, or the sort of, mystic, not too threatening, sort of over there kind of, less religion than Christianity sort of religions, right? The sort of Orientalist kind of gaze looking at Islam. And then, of course, there's, sort of a post-Cold War shift where you start to get, the United States sort of shifting its interests and its sort of economic alliances and so forth, and the Middle East sort of develops as this kind of strategic location through, for not only military intervention, but there's also this implicit sort of moral and ethical need to go to the Middle East. And all of this is sort of wrapped into Islam. So if you look at, how Americans are thinking about Islam, this sort of, the 9/11 or the post 9/11 movement is, a very kind of sharp detraction from that, right? In the middle of the 19th century, the Quran was one of the best-selling books in the United States colonies, in the colonies, but also in the new states. There are certain people, early politicians, abolitionists that had favorable views of Islam. Some of the Orientalist writings are, benevolent, right? When the founding fathers were considering Muslims as potential citizens, these kinds of antagonistic attitudes, or Islam as this thing that is inherently threatening to America, as opposed to something that was being viewed very much as, contributing to the sort of melting pot idea and the sort of foundation of America. I think that, right, so 9/11, I think just, both, you can certainly trace a genealogy of it, but I think it is this certain watershed moment that I think in terms of the broader public, at least, if anyone is to sort of start to learn about Islam knowing nothing today, it looks very different than I think before that particular moment. Yeah.
Absolutely. Dr. Miller, anything that you would want to add to what Brennan shared?
Well, I was actually living in New York on 9/11. We lived on the Upper East Side. And as someone who'd studied Islam pretty intently up to the graduate level, I can pretty safely say that Americans pretty much never thought about Islam in much of any way at all prior to 9/11. And it was a sort of crash course in the outlines of the religion in a very rough and not very accurate way that followed. So I think a lot of the animosity that appeared was in one respect kind of natural, because we had been attacked, and if you were in New York on that day, it was very clear that it happened. So I think there was a very natural sort of reaction on the one hand. On the other hand, perhaps it wasn't handled so well by those in charge. And then to learn about Islam, most people got what they knew, or what most people ended up knowing was something that came from the popular press, which had its own biases, both left and right. And I'm not sure that people really know that much now about it. I'm not necessarily convinced that most people know much more than Sharia law and 4 wives. So I'm always finding myself having to explain pretty much everything from the beginning to students in terms of what Muslims believe, and saying, look, this is an Abrahamic faith that has a great connection to Judaism and Christianity, that, Jesus is a prophet in the Quran. He's, the longest of the surahs is the one for Mary, the mother of Jesus. So my attitudes about that are always that, whatever misconceptions Americans have, it's, to some extent, perhaps understandable, and to a greater extent, perhaps correctable with more education. So it's, 9/11 was the watershed. I mean, 9/11, as you described, is the watershed. Before that, almost no one paid attention. After that, people paid attention, but not necessarily in the correct way. So that would be my answer to that question.
Thank you. All right, Dr. Chan Malik, I'm going to turn it over to you to kind of begin our discussion of really the history of Muslims and Islam in America, and maybe some of the key moments, figures, contributions, and so forth. So take it away.
Great, thank you so much. And again, thank you to everyone for joining this evening. And I want to actually start by building off the question that Mallory just asked about 9/11 and what exactly that moment catalyzed. As I just said in my opening remarks and my response to the opening question, I myself started engaging Islam and Muslims in the aftermath of 9/11 from the perspective of an Asian American woman in a PhD program in the Bay Area in California at that time, who was very much seeing the types of injustices that were happening to this community that was suddenly targeted in the wake of an attack that had happened all the way across the country. And so oftentimes what I've learned from studying the history of Islam and Muslims in the United States and Islam more broadly is that while 9/11 changed many things, it also did not shift dramatically any of the existing preconceived notions about Islam and Muslims in this country, nor the state's treatment of Islam and Muslims and its geopolitical relationships with the Middle East and Muslim countries abroad. And so what I mean by that is, I'll give you a very kind of everyday example about it. As someone who has kids, before I had kids, before I was pregnant, I never noticed that anybody was pregnant. I never noticed that anyone had kids. But the second I had them, or the second I, was walking around, suddenly I saw pregnant ladies everywhere. And I don't know if anybody else has had that example. Or you buy a new car and you're like, oh, nobody else has this color car. And all of a sudden you're driving around and you're like, oh, everybody has this color car. And so 9/11 was sort of like that in terms of the awareness of Islam and Muslims in this country, because Islam and Muslims have been here present in the United States for over 4 centuries. And for Muslims who have been living in this country, right, 9/11 didn't change everything within their lives. It changed everything outside of their lives. And we have been grappling with that within Muslim communities and within our nation ever since. So I just wanted to start by setting that up to say many of the ideas that we have about Islam and Muslims as a foreign religion, as people who do not come from here, as somehow antithetical to the West, these ideas were already in the imagination of Americans prior to 9/11. They just became exacerbated and burst onto the national scene writ large after 9/11. And again, we've been dealing with their ramifications ever since. So I wanted to share a few slides, and I have a new computer, so I am kind of struggling to learn how to use it with Zoom and, with my okay boomer status, as my children say. So can everybody see my shared screen? Is this thumbs up? Yes. And let me see if I can make it a full screen here. Slideshow. Okay, great. Is that viewable to everyone? Yes. Okay. Lovely. So I just want to briefly, I'm going to only take about 10 and 15 minutes because I would love to hear the remarks that the other speakers have tonight to bring their very rich perspectives to this conversation. But I wanted to offer an overview of the actual history of Islam and Muslims in the United States. Because while Dr. Miller rightly says that most Americans know very little about Islam and its practices in general, I would venture to say that most Americans know even less about the fact that Islam and Muslims have been here present, who Muslims have been in this country, and that they are a very rich, vibrant, and significant presence in American history. So I want to talk a little bit about that and give some frameworks and guidelines for understanding this religion's presence in the United States. I generally think about the history of Islam in America in 4 phases and shifts. And so they're listed here on this slide. In the first phase, which takes place roughly in the period between the 1500s and the 1800s, Islam arrived in the United States through the bodies of enslaved Africans. And historians have estimated that anywhere between 1/5 to 1/3 of enslaved Africans that came from the West African region of Senegambia, which is now Senegal and the Gambia, were practicing Muslims. These are predominantly Muslim countries, so it makes sense that those enslaved peoples that were violently taken from their homes and sold into chattel slavery were also Muslims as well. The next period, and I'll talk a little bit about them as I go through the rest of the slides. For the most part, these enslaved Africans who were Muslims were not allowed to practice Islam, though they tried very vigilantly. There are cases of enslaved peoples trying to do their daily prayers, trying to fast, but you can imagine that these would be very difficult rituals to perform under the horrible conditions of chattel slavery. However, many of their traditions persisted, but for the most part, there are no lasting iterations of institutional organizations that were formed by enslaved peoples during this time. Islam reemerges in the early 20th century in the aftermath of the Great Migration North, after the end of after the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation and the end of the Civil War. After 1865, formerly enslaved people start traveling north to places like Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Newark, New Jersey, close to where I am. And it's in these places that they start forming new religious communities. And one of the religions that people turn to in this moment in which they are really thinking about global conversations around challenging white supremacy and Black liberation is Islam. And it is in this moment between the 1920s and 1970s that you have the emergence of groups like the Moorish Science Temple, a group called the Ahmadiyya movement in Islam. And if any of you are jazz fans, this was a movement in which musicians like McCoy Tyner, Ahmed Jamal, Yusuf Latif, and others converted to Islam. And most famously, you have a group called the Nation of Islam, led by a man named the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and who had followers, counted among them the boxer Muhammad Ali, and of course, Malcolm X, or Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz. And so Islam reemerged from the 1920s to the 1970s amongst African American communities as a sort of protest religion, as a religion in which African Americans actively chose to reject Christianity and what they saw as the ways in which Christianity rationalized anti-Blackness. And they chose Islam as a way to join a global community of believers at this time. And so this very much emerged throughout the 20th century. So as you can see from these dates, the vast majority of Muslims in this country prior to the 1970s were African American. And in my research, in which I went extensively through news articles and politicians' speeches and things like that throughout the 20th century, if there was a reference to Islam and Muslims in the United States throughout the 20th century up to around 1970, they were almost always in reference to African American Muslims. This changes in the context of the civil rights struggles of the 1960s, because in 1965, along with the passage of the Voting Rights Act, we have the passage of something called the Hart-Celler Immigration Act. And it is the Hart-Celler Immigration Act that lifts many of the restrictive quotas that were placed on many countries around the world, including South Asia, including many countries in the Middle East, including countries in Southeast Asia. And this is the moment, the post-1965 moment, after the passage of the Hart-Celler Immigration Act, that you have a new demographic of Muslims that start coming into the United States from these regions, from Pakistan, from India, from the Middle East, and to a lesser extent, Southeast Asia. And these are professional Muslims. These are people who are coming in for graduate school, who are coming in professional vocations like engineering, doctors, with resources, right? These are people coming to seek the American dream. So they have a very different orientation than the African-American Muslims that are already here. And so this population dramatically changes the demographics of Muslims in the United States from a largely Black American community to a multiracial and extremely diverse category in the United States. And I need to say that the Muslim community in the United States is the most diverse religious community, ethnically, racially, and linguistically in this country. The final period is not one in which the Muslim community changes so much, whereas, as I said previously, the attention and understanding of that community changes. And this is the post 9/11 moment, in which I call the war on terror phase, in which Muslims come to be seen and associated with the language of terrorism, and they come to be seen through a state security lens. And this is still where we are today. And one of the ways in which, you know, we really draw political lines, and oh, what a moment to be talking about politics and Muslims right now, but that's a whole other table talk, is the ways in which we imagine Muslims as part of America or as what we stand against as Americans. And this is the moment that we occupy now. And what I argue and teach in my classes is that we must understand all of the phases that come before it to really understand what we're grappling with now. Because we are grappling with the ghost of slavery. We are grappling with the ways in which African Americans have engaged Islam. We are engaging with histories of immigration and geopolitical relationships, oil politics between the US and the Middle East. And we are grappling with state security and how we have come to create certain power relations between the state and an entire religious community. I'm going to spend the last 5 minutes just showing you some slides. I don't have time to tell you about what each slide is. If you would like, if anybody here would like more reading suggestions, please feel free to Google me and email me. I'm happy to send you a reading list or a syllabus from one of my courses so that you can go ahead and read further on any of these topics. But I'm just going to talk through, here are some images of some early enslaved Africans. On my left here, you have an image of a man named Abdurrahman, who was an enslaved African who turned out to be an African nobleman. He was literate in Arabic, and he wound up writing, and he was finally writing extensively about his experiences being enslaved, and he was finally freed by his master. A very fascinating story. And a similar story of the gentleman here that's on the right, named Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, who was also a nobleman, a prince. And they were both enslaved from their villages, and they were learned to be literate in Arabic and could read and recite Quran, and were eventually freed by their masters. You see here some images of people who were leading figures in Islam's early 20th century Renaissance. Noble Drew Ali here, who was the leader of the Moorish Science Temple. Mufti Muhammad Sadiq, who was a missionary for the group called the Ahmadiyya movement in Islam, and then Wallace Farad Muhammad, who was the founder of the Nation of Islam, who then turned the leadership of that organization on to Elijah Muhammad. And next to Elijah Muhammad here is the best known follower and minister of that movement, Malcolm X. Here are some more images of Malcolm X. And I want to end with just a gesture towards what my research looks at, and what I find to be really important always when we're talking about history is that women are always present in this history. When we talk about history in the United States, we often leave out the voices and perspectives of women. And here is an image that I look very closely at my own work. This is an image of 4 African-American women on the south side of Chicago, taken in December of 1922. These 4 women were converts to a group called the Ahmadiyya movement in Islam. And as you can see here in this really fascinating image that I love to share with people and tell the story of, you can see that these are working class African-American women in Chicago who are in their best church clothes, you know, their hats and their pressed blouses, and they've come in to take a photograph, which is no small thing in 1922, and they have found whatever they could in their linen closets, bed sheets, quilts, right, to fashion themselves in the ways that they believe Muslim women might look. And it's just a fascinating story to trace their motivations and their understandings of Islam and their imaginations of it and their study of it. And there are countless stories like these women that I talk about in my own research. And I'm just scrolling through some of the images of the women whose stories I tell in my work. And finally, I'll end by saying it is in the 1970s, in the context of oil politics in the United States, and in particular in the context of the Iranian hostage crisis, in which we start to see a shift in which Islam gets talked about in the popular media and news. And this is in 1979. As many of you remember, in the context of the hostage crisis, 9 months earlier, there had been a women's revolution in Iran as well. And this is a moment in which the vocabulary of fundamentalist Islam enters the American conversation. And it is in this time in which we become very dependent on oil from the Middle East that we start looking at the ways in which the Muslims treat women as somehow rendering them inferior to us as Americans. And it is in this moment that these images of women in veils, militant, angry, really come to pervade our consciousness in the United States. And it is after the 1970s that we start to see images of Islam and Muslims change. And that is very much informing where we are at this moment. And it always takes place in a larger context of history and politics and culture. And finally, I just wanted to end with this wonderful image that I like to share because it is of young women at my university, Rutgers University, as you see them linked arm in arm. And this is a rally and protest that the Muslim students at Rutgers held to protest the Muslim ban in 2016, I believe. And I just want to end here to show the diversity and the strength and the presence of Muslims, as you can see, the many races, cultures represented here, and women very much still taking the lead in this community, contrary to what many of the media and political narratives say. So I will stop there, and I am very excited to hear what my colleagues want to add to this rich conversation. And so thank you so much for letting me share that brief history with all of you.
Oh, yeah, thank you so much. It's an incredible overview. You covered so much in a short time, but a couple things that stand out to me is one, that even if we want to compress or collapse Islam and Muslims down to a singular story, as many often do, the diversity within Islam and among Muslims in America and beyond continues to press against that, which you highlighted so well. It just simply disallows for a singular narrative, which we know is so dangerous to abide by. And Islam and Muslims in America, just their sheer existence and the demographics simply don't allow for that. And secondly, you highlighted so well for me how we are never talking about just one thing, right? That it's always connected to these other issues, and incredible intersectionality there and how this is connected to slavery and power dynamics, liberation movements, women and gender studies, all these sorts of things. We're always talking about multiple things at one time, and these are all interconnected and intersectional. I so appreciate you highlighting those things as well as other items.
Oh, Mel, I just want to say one more thing. I'm not trying to cut into anyone's time. I just wanted to throw out there for everyone in the audience to remember that there are 1.8 billion Muslims worldwide. It is the second largest religion in the world, right? It is one of 3 Abrahamic faiths. And so just as we don't prescribe sameness to all Christians or all Jews or any other religious group, we have to ask ourselves why we have this tendency to prescribe uniformity to Muslims, right? Because Islam in Saudi Arabia looks very different from Islam in Indonesia or Islam in China or Islam in Detroit, right? Or Islam in Harlem. So I just want to kind of throw that out that there are such variations in practice, just as they are with any other faith in the world.
Absolutely. Thank you. Dr. Miller, Brennan, tell me what you're hearing from what Dr. Chan Malik has said, and what might you add to help us further layer this incredibly rich history?
I actually have a couple slides too, if you want, a couple images too, if you want to see them. I mean, just to build upon what she said, it was a very comprehensive sort of display, but I had a couple points I wanted to make about race with regard to Islam. And I have a couple of slides. Let me see if I can figure out how to share here. Hang on, and there we go. And hopefully you'll be able to see this. I'd given a talk a couple of years ago about the history of Islam in America. I divided my Muslims into a few categories: explorers, slaves, immigrants, exiles, and converts. And I think we've done Professor Chan Malik had done a very good job with focusing on slavery. I just want to talk about kind of the oddballs, Muslims who showed up in America in the 19th century and the early 20th century and integrated very well. I mean, most famously, I would give you Ali, Ibrahim bin Ali, who was a Turkish physician who found himself in America at the end of the 18th century, converted to Christianity and ended up being the ancestor, the grandfather of a governor of Kentucky. If you know about the Bin Ali Stakes up in Kentucky, the horse race, well, his great-grandfather was a Muslim. And there were other groups too. There were groups of, in the early 20th century, there were a lot of groups who came from the Ottoman Empire as settlers. So I think I'd mentioned, I don't think I mentioned it, but the Mother Mosque in the United States is actually a group of Syrian Muslims and Lebanese Muslims who settled in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And this is the oldest mosque in America from the 1930s. There's actually an older mosque, there you go, 1934. There's actually an older mosque out there in, of all places, Ross, Nebraska, a sod mosque built by a group of Syrian immigrants who homesteaded in northeast or northwest North Dakota, and built their mosque. I actually visited there a couple of years ago and took a picture of the graveyard. Took a picture of the graveyard where many of them are buried, and there's rock. It's actually in the Bakken right now. It's in where the big oil boom is happening, the fracking boom. Otherwise it's a pretty godforsaken place. There's the interior of the little reconstructed mosque, and here's the graveyard where these Muslims were buried. And you can see some of a few of them. They integrated pretty well into American society. And one of the points I wanted to make is that there's a big racial difference with how we regarded, until fairly recently, how we regarded Muslims. And that was that individual Muslims who were from the Middle East were largely able to integrate fully as white. In fact, one of the things that's really important to know about the slave stories, we back up a bit, and Professor Chan Malik mentioned a couple of these characters, Abdurrahman Ibrahim ibn Suri, and he's a character who was a literate Muslim who was taken slave in the Senegambia and found himself, I believe, in South Carolina. And if you could prove you could read and write Arabic, in a sense, that shifted you from being black to being an Arab. And so at that point, you could make a suit to be freed, which is exactly what happened in a couple of 3 cases, and could sue to be freed and potentially returned back to Africa. So there's a gigantic racial divide between black Muslims and Muslims who have the potential to be seen as Arab or Turkish or Persian. And in the case of the latter, Arab or Persian, could achieve a kind of full integration into American society. One would think of something like the Lebanese Christian Danny Thomas, an actor who, because he was Christian, settled in Toledo, where there's a very large community at the turn of the century, a very large community of Muslims and Christians from Lebanon and Syria. Who largely integrated into white America, as opposed to something like black Africans who are using Islam as a way of distinguishing themselves, as a way of setting themselves apart from Christian society, as a way of distinguishing themselves separately. So there's a couple of things going on here that to me are really fascinating with regard to Islam as a counterweight either to racial identity, or possibly as something that can be kind of just become, like you are, if you're white enough, you can integrate and maintain a kind of a white Islamic or white Muslim identity. The other category I want to talk about, I want Brandon to talk about this too. The other category I included in my talk many years ago was I included the category of converts, because the conversion to Islam among Americans is actually a phenomenon of some long standing. I mean, the earliest American convert we know of is a guy named William Russell Webb, who converts at the end of the 19th century. It's a bit of an eccentric. He's a translator of the Quran and of other Arabic texts, but this is a kind of a rather kind of a common thing. There are enough people who convert. I mentioned, of course, black. For Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X and Mos Def are converts to Islam, but so is Louis Arquette, the man in the upper right-hand corner, the father of Patricia Arquette, the actress. These are, on the left is a friend of mine, a professor now at Tufts named Joseph Lombard, who's actually, oddly, his family's from Nashville, but he converted to Islam in Egypt and now goes by Yusuf Shukri as an expert in Sufism. And on the right is a former Methodist minister named Gerald Dirks, who converted to Islam. And often they'll often cite religious reasons for converting. And the main one frequently is a disbelief in the Trinity. So if we were to talk about why people convert to Islam, why do Americans convert to Islam, this is often cited as one reason, in addition to, of course, family reasons that many people do. There's Webb. And one more person I want to bring up, because oh yes, of course, in the 19th century, there is, of course, a kind of fashion for dressing up as Muslims. This is not a Muslim, not Muslims, and of course, not Muslims. So something like the shrine as a mimicry of Islamic style or Islamic fashion. Here's Alexander Russell Webb. And this character is Suhaib Webb. And Suhaib Webb is a young man, or actually now he's probably my age, he's in his 50s, I believe, who's become one of the foremost youth imams in America. He speaks especially to American-born Muslims who are quite young. As you can see, he's about 6'3" tall, a husky guy with blue eyes. He was born William Webb in Oklahoma and was, Monica, you'll appreciate this, was actually raised Church of Christ. His William Webb, Suhaib Webb's grandfather was on the board of directors at Oklahoma Christian. And he converted as a young man to Islam. And today he's quite popular among young American-born Muslims. And he argues that Islam should be kind of retrofitted or customized for the American context. His argument is that many Muslims who come to America, their parents arrive as immigrants and they want them to live their Islamic faith. They want to live in a way that's congruent with Pakistan or Egypt or Saudi Arabia, whereas the young people are American, they are fully American, and they wish to live American lives, albeit American lives as Muslims. And Suhaib Webb, the character on the screen there, is probably the voice of that movement. So a convert. So I wanted to ask Brennan about his conversion experience, because I'm fascinated by these conversions to Islam and how they work. And I'll stop my sharing for the moment here, so we can get at it. So.
Yeah, thanks. Dr. Chan Malik, that historical overview was incredible. And Dr. Miller, I really enjoyed your slides as well. There's this Native American scholar named Phil Deloria who wrote a book called Indians in Unexpected Places, where he's sort of showing, these images sort of, characteristic of the Indian in the American imagination, right? So, you wouldn't imagine, a woman in a powwow, a jingle dress, driving a convertible or something, right? This image is sort of, it sort of evokes, right, Native peoples as stuck in the past with like a brand new sports car that is, emblematic of, the modern kind of period. And I kind of think of, my current research interests and, which are sort of just, the way that I think about Islam in America is, the first term that I always use is one that I got from Dr. Chan Malik, which is foundational blackness, right? That Islam is often imagined as this thing over there, but its presence in the Americas is still yet to, I think, be fully uncovered. I think there's a lot of people in a range of disciplines that are trying to uncover the full extent at which Islam has been here, right? Including, rumors of pre-Columbian travels to the Americas. Turkey as a state very much, is invested in projects of, confirming, like the presence of Turkish people in the Americas before Europeans. And, these things, sort of run up against a lot of, social movements today, particularly indigenous struggles. But needless to say that Islam is really just everywhere. And I think that it is the fact that this thing has been so heavily concealed is not accidental, that it's deliberate and so forth. And this sort of, I think ties into, how I converted to Islam too, right? Because I think, one of the questions that I get is, like, how could you do this? How could this happen, right? Particularly in this post 9/11 moment, particularly when religion is sort of seen as something backwards or something, to be forgotten. In America, it's sort of, to become the sort of, full American individual, it often requires to forget your roots, to forget your culture, to forget your family. And all of these things, I think, are, still strongly represented in Islam as a theology, but also in sort of how Islam takes shape and how it looks historically. To the question about my own particular conversion, I often, actually a teacher of mine, Abdul Rahman Malik, who's here right now, has heard me tell this story numerous times, that I think of this one particular woman named Zainab Cobbold, who was Scottish royalty. She's sort of the first woman recorded, first Western woman rather, at least recorded in history as going on Hajj, and she wrote about it. She has these really cool writings in a book called Pilgrimage to Mecca. And in the start of that, she has this one very sweet paragraph where she says, "If this be Islam, asks Goethe, do we not all live in Islam? Yes, answers Carlyle, all of us have any moral life, we all live so." And then Zainab Cobbold goes on to say, "I'm often asked when and why I became a Muslim. I can only reply that I do not know the precise moment when the truth of Islam dawned on me. It seems that I've always been a Muslim. This is not so strange when one remembers that Islam is the natural religion that a child left to itself would develop. Indeed, as a Western critic once described it, Islam is the religion of common sense." I think one of the ways that I sort of, characterize my own sort of, path to Islam, I think a lot of people always expect there to be this sort of easy sort of, one step from Christianity to Islam, I think, that they're often talked about as being very, very similar. And, there certainly are, right? They hail from this tradition, the same names that you would read in the Bible are ones that appear in the Quran. But this sort of, it's almost like an easy translation, that, right? So it's sort of, I mean to say that people will often imagine Islam in terms of Christianity, right? So Muhammad will often be like, oh, the Muslim Jesus or something, right? Not assuming that, you cannot be a Muslim categorically unless you also believe in Jesus. This one particular Quran verse uses the language that telling Muslims that of the people, in the world, which are also not categorized easily into Muslim, non-Muslim, or, believer, non-believer, right? There are actually different types of human beings that don't fall into a Muslim or non-Muslim binary, at least in how the Quran frames this. But it says that the closest people to the Muslims will be the Christians. And I think there are many ways to sort of think about this, but having grown up in Appalachia, I was raised Baptist. My family sort of instilled, religion and justice being very linked early on in my imaginary. And it was sort of, for me, it just sort of dawned on me very slowly. I think I very much went from somebody who was studying Muslims as this sort of thing that I could no longer ignore back home, or that I could no longer ignore in sort of the literature that I was looking at. But then it also just sort of became this social setting that I found myself, being comfortable in, building family in. I think Dr. Chan Malik, can relate to some of this too, where there's a point where you sort of just find yourself and you're kind of in Islam already, but you haven't really, said the Shahada and officially converted. And I think that I still sort of, I'm piecing together the narrative for myself. But I think if I could, give one easy answer, it would just sort of be, that these sort of unexpected encounters, unexpected places just sort of started to make sense when I started to think about them in the new kind of frameworks that Islam provided me with.
Did you learn Arabic? Were you learning Arabic first and then converted, or did you convert and then start learning Arabic?
That's a good question. Yeah, I actually didn't know a word of Arabic until after I converted. One of my advisors here actually used this term that I loved, which is DIY Islam, right? So I was, looking up how to pray. I had like these prayer books, I had printed things out in like the transliterated Arabic. I, read the Quran in English, but I was, I have like 4 or 5 different translations of the Quran in English, trying to sort of, negotiate and sort of, get to the understanding of Arabic. But I started to, study, modern standard Arabic and classical Arabic, probably about 2 years after I converted. I know for a lot of people it is
just the other way around. Most people I've known who converted usually start learning Arabic, and then as they get deeper into it, they convert because they've come in contact with the language, and the language has a beauty. It's a very beautiful language in its way. It may not sound on first hearing, but once you're into it, there's a kind of logic and beauty to it that's very appealing. And many of the converts I've known have gone that route to get there. I mean, although Suhaib Webb, the imam who actually went off to Al-Azhar and became an imam, he did it because he was a street kid. He was a kid who was smoking dope and doing rap music, and saw that the Muslim brothers were the people who had their act together. And at 19 or 20, he started following them, and then learned Arabic after that, after he had converted. So I'm always interested in those conversion stories, because to me they're very American. There's nothing more American than remaking yourself into something new.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting. Like, I very much, that's sort of the remaking of the self, I think, is that one thing that I'm sort of like, well, when did that actually happen? I think it's sort of, it happens without even realizing it. And yeah, I think the same, like almost everyone I've met who has been a convert too has also been somebody that, one way or another was studying Arabic, and then sort of, was so enthralled by the beauty of it. Well, I feel like I may have had some of these experiences too. I think, hearing the Quran recited in Arabic, I think, even if one is unable to understand the Arabic, that in a lot of people, this generates sort of, bodily responses or affective responses that, are very touching and moving, and sort of, where language can't almost, describe certain things, the sort of, very deeply personal and intuitive kind of things, I think, come in to sort of supplant that.
One of my areas of study is the influence of Islam on Christianity in the Middle Ages. And you find quickly that there's a lot of ideas that are deeply embedded in the Western canon or the Western ideas, musical themes. Actually, one of the things I've been writing on for a while is the idea that romantic love comes into Western Europe from the Islamic world. And so there's a lot of things in Islam, as I got into it much more deeper, that seem very familiar, right? Having, started from scratch as in Northern California as a, kind of a typical California teen, and then moving over, it really, there was a lot that just seemed familiar and kind of homey about it in some ways. I didn't convert, but intellectually I kind of converted in some respects, converted to someone who had a deep appreciation for the culture, so.
Thank you to each of you. I want to pose one final question, and then I'm going to open it up for those who are joining the conversation tonight to engage. Each of you has shared so much, and it's been so rich and layered and intersectional, as we said. So I'm curious if there's a sort of a word that you might speak to those who are listening that would help us take what you have given and help us apply it in some particular way. So a way to think about that is shifting this information from just being in our heads and being fairly intellectual to how can this move to our hands and to our hearts in ways that we live, in ways that we engage with our Muslim neighbors, in ways that we become allies for our Muslim neighbors, or for the Muslims who are joining us tonight, how this might inform the ways that they live among their neighbors as well. Dr. Chan Malik, I'll start with you here. Oh, you're still muted.
Oh, Zoom. Still learning. Once I learn it, maybe inshallah, we won't have to be on Zoom so much. So one thing I would say is that one of the biggest struggles that I have as someone who teaches, speaks, and writes frequently about Islam in the United States specifically is that there is so much misinformation out there that it is very challenging to enter a sea of misinformation and try to engage in ways that, for me, are not just simply asking people to accept Muslims or be nice to Muslims or just smile at a Muslim. Those things are lovely and fine. But what I think we need to do is radically reshift and interrogate ourselves about why we think the ways we do about certain groups of people. So I always say, when I'm doing public talks, holy books are objects. The Bible is an object. I'm not saying the content of it, but in and of itself, the Quran is a book. You can buy it. There's different translations. Just because I hit you with the book or I put it in your hands doesn't mean it somehow magically absorbs into your body and suddenly becomes dogma or some sort of belief system that you have. People filter religions. People interpret religions into their lives. And as many different people, Muslims that there are as many different types of lived experiences and interpretations of Islam that there are. And so if we can just afford Islam and Muslims this basic, simple fact that we afford to every other group of people, every other religious group. We afford it to Christian groups. We understand Jews are very different. We understand even Buddhists and Hindus have a lot of variation within those communities. We have to ask ourselves, why do we paint with such a broad brush for Islam and Muslims, and really do some self-reflection about that? So that would be one practical, just, everyday thing, when you say, I hear these words, jihad, Sharia, why do I think those things in relation to Muslims? And maybe I should find out why, and maybe I should correct and try to educate myself. Secondly, in the context of the United States, I really cannot emphasize, any more strongly than I think I tried to do in my overview and in my opening comments, that Islam is not a foreign religion. Islam is a religion that has been in the United States since its inception, if not before. And Muslims have toiled and struggled and labored to build this country along with all the other diverse groups of people in this country. Many of these Muslims have been African Americans and have worked under the most excruciating of circumstances. And so there is this diversity and presence within the American Muslim community that, even though you may not see it, is important to be aware of at all times. And I really think it would be a wonderful kind of starting point if you wanted to have a deeper and richer conversation around Islam in America, to do some preliminary research into the history of African American Islam and Black Muslims, because I think that gives so much insight into how Islam manifests itself in different locations at different spaces in time, and how it just tells a distinctly American story about race, religion, gender, and our nation itself.
Thank you. Dr. Miller, any words that you would want to add to that?
I was very eloquent. I can't add much to that. I mean, it was a pretty good, it was a very good statement. I'm just not, I just can't emphasize enough. It's just a matter of education to a large point, and being willing to be open to being educated and to read more. I mean, I guess I'm a little Pollyanna-ish. I believe that education solves a lot of problems, and we spend not enough time reading and not enough time thinking about things. But so that's all I have to say.
Thank you. Brennan, what might you say to those on the call and in our community who want to apply this content in a meaningful way?
Yeah, I think I would even probably take it so far as to, just encourage people to, do something deliberate, like attend a mosque, and perhaps regularly, right? People sort of imagine mosques as being, closed to everyone, but quite, in the definition of what a mosque is, mosques are not actually just for Muslims, right? They're not the property of Muslims. They're the property of everyone living in the community in which a mosque is built. I think so often, I'm thinking back to even the sort of media around when the Islamic Center in Tennessee was the Islamic Center of Tennessee was built, that, you had some news networks trying to paint the picture of this very inflammatory response. But as Sandra Ivy wrote in this master's thesis she wrote out of Eastern Tennessee State, when she went to Maryville, I believe, or I'm not sure where this place is actually, but somewhere in Middle Tennessee, I believe. She talked to people and she couldn't really find a soul, that had anything wrong with this mosque being built, right? You had, several, long time, deep country folks saying, they were excited to see a new playground being built or a new school, that mosques are not just, a place to worship, but they're also a place to learn, a place to relax, a place to congregate. So I think doing something deliberate. Oh yes, thank you very much, David. Murfreesboro, that's right. Yeah, so this is in Murfreesboro. And so, yeah, I think doing something intentional, something lived, right? I think I tried to stress the importance that Islam is very much a lived, a very communal, very kinship-oriented religion, right? The the terms brother and sister are thrown around, very casually. So I think, doing something like making a Muslim friend intentionally, even though, I wouldn't go up to someone and be like, hey, are you a Muslim? Great, let's be friends. But, I think that Muslims would like to hear, comments like, oh, I'm reading the Quran, or, I went to a talk and I learned about Islam. I think that these things are very often seen as like, oh, I don't want to bother them, or, maybe they're only asked about the religion all the time. But I bet, 9 times out of 10, if you were to, go up to someone, and also there's the problem of assuming what a Muslim looks like, but if you see someone, that they're a Muslim, whether it's a coworker or a classmate, try to get to know them. And I think you would be surprised just about how immediately you would find similarities and common ground, and how quickly that the images about Islam that I think everybody, regardless of intention or background, has sort of internalized just by virtue of being present in this place, that I think that those images may start to erode in your own kind of personal way.
If you don't mind, Mallory, and Brennan, thank you so much, because as you were speaking, I thought of just one, again, concrete thing. As a Muslim woman myself, who has many friends who wear the headscarf, that makes them very visibly Muslim in public spaces, it is a very vulnerable position in this moment, in this political moment in our country, to move through society as a Muslim woman, in particular, one who wears the scarf. And so one very concrete thing I would ask everyone to do is that if you see a Muslim woman in a public space and she wears the headscarf, I'm not telling you to stare at her or be very aware, but like I said, almost every Muslim woman I know who's visibly Muslim has been victimized in some way, either through comments or actual threats of physical violence. So if you could just have an awareness of this in public spaces. That would be something that you can just keep in mind. Again, this is not to tell you to stare or to be very, but just be aware that this is very real. This is not something that is in people's minds. That danger is present in Muslims' lives every single day.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So at this point, I'm going to invite those of you who have joined us for this conversation. If you'd like to make your video visible, you can join us in that way. And begin, I'm going to open it up with a question that came to me privately through a chat as we kind of get started, but then I'd like to hear from who are on the call. So, Becky had asked if some of you might be able to speak to and expand on the diversity of thought within Islam. You shared that obviously there's incredible diversity ethnically and racially and beyond linguistically, but specifically, might you elaborate on kind of diversity of thought and give us a few examples of what that looks like within Islam? And as you all, as the panelists begin to share, I'll invite those, again, who might want to open their videos and join us in that way if you'd like, and we'll turn it over to you for questions.
Mm-hmm. I'll just give a really quick, and I'm sure Dr. Miller and Brenna, you both have probably a lot to say on this. I mean, there are a number of sects, and in Islam, probably the most well-known kind of differences that everyone has heard of are Sunnis and Shias. And this difference, Sunni and Shia, is based in what people see as the genealogy that comes from the Prophet Muhammad, who was the rightful leader of Islam after the passing of the Prophet Muhammad. And so these types of differences have created these different sects. And really, within the context of the United States, these ideological differences historically have not caused so much concern within American Muslim communities, right? But they are very rooted in regional and cultural differences in places. So there are these sectarian differences, and perhaps my co-panelists can expand a little bit more upon those. But I also wanted to say that politically, Muslims run the gamut of the political spectrum, right? So prior to the George Bush election, prior to 9/11, there was a poll that said that the vast majority of American Muslims in this country actually voted Republican. Not African Americans, Muslims, mind you, but non-Black, mostly immigrant Muslims were mostly Republican on the political spectrum. In the post 9/11 era, this has changed dramatically in the face of state targeting and surveillance of Muslim communities. And the Muslim community has now largely turned to the Democratic Party, right, in terms of their political affiliation. You also have very liberal and progressive Muslims in terms of the same types of issues that liberals and progressives are in mainstream society: LGBTQ rights, women's rights, racial justice, all these types of things. And you have what we might call more traditional and conservative Muslims who might align more with Republican, conservative, or evangelical values. So again, it's hard to say what the spectrum is because it is so diverse, but those are some of the things that I thought of off the top of my head.
Great. Dr. Miller or Brennan, anything that you would add to that question about the diversity of thought within Islam?
Yeah, with regard to religiously, I mean, it's like it would be trying to characterize what Muslims believe would be like trying to characterize what Christians believe. I mean, you have this incredible scope of Christian belief that's somewhat, at least in the size of it, is mirrored by Islamic belief. I mean, if you've traveled in Morocco, there are popular saints in Morocco. If you've been in the peninsula, on the Arabian Peninsula, you're likely to meet Wahhabism, which is a very fundamentalist, strict form of Islam. In Iran, it's Shiism. You head out to Southeast Asia, there's a variety of Sufi groups. So there's a huge diversity of thought. And if you ever really want to get into that, the literature is stacks and stacks deep and very detailed, much like some of the theological arguments between various Christian groups. Professor Chan Malik hit it exactly on the head with regard to Muslims and voting patterns in the United States. Many of the Muslims I know are actually Trump supporters because they're small business people, and so they're on that scale. But then my academic friends who are Muslims are Democrats, and so Muslims are integrating fairly as we've been saying over and over again, are integrating into all areas of American life, including the political. And so I would advise you to, if you want to know the scope of American political thought, go up and look at what's going on in Dearborn, Michigan, or in Detroit, which has the largest concentration of Muslims in America. And you can find Republican Muslims and Democrat Muslims and DSA Muslims. So it's again, Muslims don't think alike any more than Christians do.
Well said. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just go ahead and echo the things that Dr. Miller and Dr. Chan Malik have both said, right? Islam, the way that, subjects are discussed, or right, Islamic sciences are learned, whether it's, jurisprudence or theology or the Quran, you're going to sort of get, different people that sort of, disagree. And, historically, you sort of get, movements naturally, just as you do in literature or in arts, or in any kind of cultural production, that you sort of get trends that you can sort of retroactively historicize. It definitely doesn't happen as simple as like, one day, Imam Hanbal, woke up and decided to start a new school of law or something, but it does sort of reflect the interests, the desires of Muslims living at the time. But I think something that, is sort of, that we deal with today is that, I was talking with friends, I have, lots of Muslim friends that were, born in Muslim families, but don't know, for example, which madhab they follow. And a madhab is going to be a particular school of Islamic law and jurisprudence, to be specific. So, even, you may have, Muslims that sort of cling to these kinds of, sectarian labels, and these things sort of, mean things in certain cultural contexts that sort of might puzzle away here. Right, in America, you'll have Sunnis praying next to Shias, praying next to Ahmadis, praying next to whoever. The largest mosque in the United States, I believe, is technically a Shia mosque. So it's, I think when it comes to diversity, it is just sort of, as Dr. Chan Malik said, it's the most diverse religious community in the West. But something that's really cool about this diversity too is that, the fact that whether you're a Shia Muslim from Bangladesh meeting, an Ahmadi from Southside Chicago, that there's still the Quran that sort of runs through. There's certain threads that run through and sort of, bring Muslims together in a way that I have personally experienced as, being different than certain other faith communities. That there are certain things that, and, I probably couldn't name what these things are that Muslims even have in common, because there are so many, diversity of opinions and practices, styles and aesthetics and politics and so forth. And, the idea that, Muslim unity has existed, I don't think you can sort of point at a point in history and say that all of the Muslims were united under anything. But there is still some sort of effective kind of Muslim vibe that, I've gotten from any Muslim that I've met, no matter who they are or where they're from. And I think that may go back to the Quran, that we read it in its, original Arabic. Unlike the Bible, if the Quran is translated into another language, it'll often say the interpretation and meaning of the Quran, right? It won't say that it is the Quran itself. And these kinds of things, where you sort of get, one text in one language, I think does allow for, this beautiful kaleidoscope of diversity to still take shape, but still happen under one category, which is that thing called Islam, right? That Islam, unlike other categories, as Shahab Ahmed wrote in his book, What is Islam? That it's one category that can somehow maintain contradictions, whereas other categories don't, right? For instance, racial categories. If you're born to white parents, you can't be another race, for instance. But, so that's a contradiction, right? You can't be black if you're white. But in Islam, you can be a Muslim if you drink alcohol. You can be a Muslim if you eat pork. Or, that there have been Muslims that drink alcohol, or there have been Muslims that eat pork. And I'm still sort of fleshing out what this is, in my own kind of being in the world.
Thank you. All right, we had another question here from William, as the panelists likely can see here, specifically speaking about Black North American Muslim movements, but how those movements have informed and shaped hip hop culture and the impact of this has had on American society. Any of you might want to pick that up?
I love your question, William. Thank you. Because it actually, I was just thinking, so one of the big differences, and again, like I'm speaking specifically about American Muslim communities, when you talk about the percentage breakdown is that African American Muslims still are about 25 to 30% of the American Muslim community. South Asian Muslims are about 30%, and and then 35 to 40% Arab American Muslims from the Middle East and North Africa. And then there are white converts. Latinos are actually the fastest growing group within the Muslim community in the US. They are the largest growing demographic, Latino converts to Islam. And then you have people who are mixed race, indigenous Native American converts to Islam, etc. So in all of that, what I wanted to point out is that there are these distinctive ways of thinking about Islam within that community. African Americans have a distinctive way of thinking about Islam because, as I said, they chose the religion as an alternative to Christianity. And because it was chosen as a sort of social protest against Christianity, it has informed so much of what Islamic and Muslim culture is in America, including hip hop. And so the best known Muslims that you're gonna know in America are hip hop artists like Mos Def, like Lupe Fiasco, like, kind of the Islamic references in the Wu-Tang Clan, Public Enemy in the 80s and 90s. And so the way this happens is that you have the Nation of Islam, you have Malcolm X in a nutshell, right? And in the 1960s and 70s, these offshoots, most prominently a group called the 5% Nation of gods and earth, right? So if anybody's heard of this group. And this is a group that does not call themselves Muslims, but they use the imagery of Islamic texts. And the folks who started this group come out of the Nation of Islam. And so many hip hop artists are 5 percenters. They come out of the 5% Nation. So the guys in the Wu-Tang Clan, members of the Refugees, the Fugees, right? All of these hip hop artists are somehow affiliated. Busta Rhymes came out of the 5%ers. And so you have this very strong presence of Islam and hip hop. Some have even gone so far to say is that Islam is the unofficial religion of hip hop. And so this is what's so interesting about the US Muslim community. So is that even if you are a young Pakistani first generation teenager growing up in America, and you, like any other teenager, is sort of searching for your identity. Who am I as a Muslim America? What are you going to loop back around to? You're going to start saying, who's a famous Muslim American? Malcolm X. What's a Muslim American artist I can listen to? Mos Def. And then you're going to run into this history that is African American Islam. And so, you have this really rich history that comes out of hip hop culture, out of jazz, out of entertainers, etc., which makes this beauty and diversity of the American Muslim community. So thanks for that question. That's how I kind of got into Islam too. I'm from Oakland, California, so hip hop very much shaped my own engagement and understanding of Islam. So I love talking about Islam and hip hop.
That's great. Thanks for that question, William, and thanks for your response. We've got time for about one more question, and so I want to open it up to anyone else who's joining to want to unmute yourself and quickly share your question or your comments for our panelists.
I got a question.
Great. So it said, thanks for a great discussion. Yes, I was wondering if the speakers could speak about particular moments or strategies utilized by Muslims as a form of resistance to state terror, surveillance, etc. So we've got just a couple moments. That's obviously an incredibly loaded question, but I want to turn that over to the panelists to speak to in our remaining time.
And there was also a question from, I think, Amr. I don't know if you want to just go ahead and ask it, and then we could, all three of us, address kind of both of your questions in our closing answers.
Great, please go ahead, Amr.
Yeah, it was actually something that Mr. Brennan mentioned about the last. comments I made on the contradictory nature and the belief of.
I'm sorry, Amr, we can't hear you very well.
uh,
I can't. I don't know if anybody else can.
Can you guys hear me better now? Okay, so it was the last comment that Mr. Brennan made about the contradictory nature, not the nature, but the actions and the beliefs systems that especially the young youth of Muslims that are coming up in the next generation, while they drink and eat pork and then still are able to consider themselves Muslim, I think is helping get away from the way that I grew up. The diversity was internal. So I grew up with going into like Muslim school, and I'm from Pakistan. So those who were able to speak Arabic almost were treated like better Muslims, versus where someone who didn't know how to speak Arabic naturally, like me, weren't treated with that same level of, dignity. So I know the whole discussion was diversity of Muslims and integration of Muslims into the culture. But if you guys want to have a discussion, like talk about something about the diversity of Muslims that are already within the Muslim community and how there's almost, that feels like there's a hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Hello?
There we go.
There we go, Dr. Miller.
No, I think I mentioned Suhaib Webb, who a figure that kind of interests me greatly. He was at the mosque in Boston for a long time, and as a convert. And I was always impressed. I'd watch his videos, and I was very impressed by the fact that he had thousands of people in his audience, thousands of young people in his audience, and was talking explicitly about making an American version of Islam. That if you were Pakistani, your parents came from Pakistan, they wanted you to practice not just like Islam, but a very Pakistani cultural matrix. Or if your parents were from North Africa, it was a North African practice. And these young people were raised in America, and they wanted to date, they wanted to listen to music, they wanted to do everything that American teens or young American people would do. They felt they saw themselves as American. And Webb was trying to put together a kind of justification for this. He's a very well-educated man. He'd studied at Azhar. He was using scripture to do this. And I was always impressed by kind of the outpouring of affection for him. And I'm not really sure what's happened in the last 3 years. I've not kept up with them. I don't know what has happened to that movement, but I think of all the movements that I kind of had followed, to me, it seemed like one of the most important ones with regard to Islam in America, to make a kind of a legitimately American, culturally American version of Islam that would seem American and not, Pakistan. I mean, again, now it would be a blended sort of culture. But remember, Muslims are diverse. They're from everywhere, Muslims are. And so the cultural variations are quite large. And Webb was working on, kind of the framework for producing an American Islam, which I really found cool and kind of appealing in its way. So.
Thank you. I'm going to ask if Dr. Chamalik or Brennan wanted to speak to either that question or to Julian's question that came up a moment ago before we close.
I wanted to say something quickly, but I wanted to give Brennan the last word. I just wanted to say, I wanted to respond to Julian's question about strategies utilized by Muslims as a form of resistance. And I don't want to just speak to one, but I want to say that even as 9/11 changed the spotlight on Muslims as subjects of the state and rendered them subjects of state violence and really created, a glaring spotlight on the community. That was in and of itself a quite small community in this country. Muslims are less than 2% of the American population, yet we take up so much space on your airwaves, right? So that's a really interesting thing. But what has come out of the post 9/11 moment for US Muslim communities is an outpouring of conversation, of scholarship, of connection, of community building, of activism, of resistance that has only increased in the last 20 years. And a moment in which you really saw this come to fruition and was incredibly inspiring was in the protests against the Muslim ban in 2016 and 2017. When you saw impromptu protests at airports, in the street, you saw Muslims creating prayer services at the airport in Dallas to protest these travel bans, and these are new coalitions that are being built, not just amongst Muslim communities themselves, but with other allies as well, with African American groups, with Asian American, with Japanese Americans. There were alliances built between Muslims and Japanese who had been interned during World War II, right? So there have been incredible amounts of activism and resistance. There are so many groups and vibrant cultures that are coming up all over this country. There's a beautiful website that I encourage all of you to go to called Sapelo Square, which is a beautiful website that looks at the histories of African American Muslims and their histories of liberation and struggle in this country. So those are all moments. And to Amar's comment, yes, there are so many internal divisions within the US Muslim communities around issues of race, class, Arabic, political orientation. And so these types of issues you can't even get into because Americans, kind of Americans writ large, are really just learning about what Islam and Muslims are. And there's so much complexity within the community. So it's really imperative to make those spaces where you can have those conversations with your peers in the context while we are still engaging with this larger misunderstanding of Islam and in the broader American context. So these are some of the struggles and difficulties and challenges that US Muslims are facing on a daily basis. And so I think it's ultimately just really important to be aware that there is a whole nexus of concerns that Muslims in this country deal with on a daily basis.
Thank you. Brennan, you get the final word. Anything that you want to share here?
Great. I think both of these questions are so wonderful, and I feel like we could have an entire kind of another hour and a half conversation about just these two questions alone. Julian is my twin brother, actually. I'll answer his question first. I guess, I guess it doesn't need more of an answer, but I think Dr. Chen Malik covered it perfectly. That, I think, at a certain point that, so I'm trying to sort of work through the differences between a geographer and a historian. And I think that maybe historians are concerned with these macro events, whereas geographers kind of like the minutia, the sort of everyday, the normal, because that's kind of how, more geographic change happens, I guess. So I think that, I'm very attuned to sort of everyday things that Muslims are doing, to sort of avoid surveillance. Numerous things like there's a whole surveillance called Nazar that is all about Muslims, navigating surveillance, historicizing surveillance, right? I think when we think of surveillance too, that so often we think about technology, actual cameras surveilling you, but the first Muslims to be surveilled were of course going to be the enslaved Muslim people, slave catchers observing them, and, public eye and, investments in whiteness about passing and so on and so forth. All of these sort of come into play. I think even though we imagine surveillance as being sort of the realm of, security studies, international affairs, these kinds of areas. And to Ahmar's question, I think, that there's just, there's a big hierarchy in the American Muslim community of, who's deemed authentic, who's deemed, more Muslim than thou. And I think that it very much does sort of, it does sort of reflect, I think, the broader social problems that I think the United States is going through. You can sort of track these to sort of, be responsible for the divisions or the sort of complications you're naming within Muslim communities, right? For instance, if you were to go anywhere and see a Muslim, they sort of garner their authority by dressing Arab, right? A white thobe, a shamah on their head, but you'll never see them wearing a suit or a cowboy hat or, any kind of, you may see this, but it's not going to be linked to their authority as a Muslim or their knowledge as a Muslim or how good their Arabic is. And you could probably attribute this to, the sort of inevitable success of what you might call, Salafism or Wahhabism, right? A great portion of Islamic literature, Dawah literature about bringing people to Islam, it's produced in publishing houses in Saudi Arabia. And this, so if you're using, translations in English and, sort of Saudi ideas and propagate that, then you tend to sort of, get, this idea that there is a pure Islam, and what does this look like? It looks like what the Saudis do. So this is sort of, a big, it's hard to pinpoint one source, but, I think the moment that we're in with, several overlaid global crises, that I think you can sort of trace, something as little as why is a thobe deemed more authentic, but, a black man in a dandy suit not equally as authentic, when Islam is supposed to be a universal religion, right, for everybody. Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you so much to each of you, to Dr. Chanmelek, to Dr. Miller, to Brennan, for all that you've offered us tonight. This has been incredibly rich, and in an hour and a half, we have covered so much. So sincerely, thank you. Thank you for what you've offered each of us. I'm thrilled to know that the folks joining us here live tonight have gotten to hear this, but also to know that we'll have this recording for those who are not able to join live, and for weeks and months and years to come, even, that this information can still be accessible to them. So thank you for that. I want to add one final word as we close, as our panelists offered some really, really important suggestions for each of us to consider. How do we apply this information, if you will? How do we transition this from just sort of remaining in our brains and new information that we add there to actually shifting it to our hands or our hearts in the ways that we sort of live and engage with our Muslim neighbors? We've certainly talked about education, among other options, but I want to offer one other, and that is relationship building, which is central to the work that Faith and Culture Center is seeking to do. I've often said that for a person who is a non-Muslim, if they meet one Muslim, they often think that they know Islam, and then they meet two Muslims and they realize that they know two Muslims, because of the types of diversity that our panelists so well described tonight, which is true of any group. And you can only come into contact with that if you become face-to-face with those who are different from you, whether it's difference in faith or whatever it may be. And so we have a program called A Seat at the Table, where we seek to bring people together across divides to do just that, to share meals when we're able to outside of COVID, and to share facilitated dialogue so we can build that type of community, build those relationships, and get to know one another at a much deeper level. So in the email that I'll send the recording with of tonight's table talk, I'm also going to share an invitation for you all to join that. And while we certainly miss getting to have that program in person right now due to COVID, I'm thrilled that people outside of Middle Tennessee are now able to join in our Seat at the Table program, which is our flagship program. And so again, I'll issue that invitation to each of you to join, to continue this conversation and other conversations, to help get to know our neighbors, and certainly our Muslim neighbors. So with that, once again, on behalf of FCC, thank you sincerely to our panelists, to each of you, for all that you've offered tonight. Thank you to our guests for joining, for posing thoughtful questions. We are thrilled that you've joined us. I hope you'll join us for the remaining 2 table talks in our series, which I'll also include in that email. And to our panelists, any resources that you might want to share. I know you named a few in your time tonight, but if there's any that you think would be helpful to share with our community, please send to me, and then I'll be happy to distribute to those of you who've registered for the table talk. Thank you all again. Good evening, and very best to each of you.